My name is Jessie, and I'm 30 years old, working as a hairdresser. I'll soon be fulfilling my long-held dream of opening my own salon. I had set a goal to become independent by the age of 30. To raise the capital, I diligently saved every month. All my efforts paid off, and I found a property that was just right, even if it was modest. I could have borrowed money to start the business, but I had vowed never to do so after witnessing the hardships my mother faced. My father disappeared because he couldn't repay his debts, and my mother had to juggle multiple jobs to repay them. The last thing I would have ever imagined was ending up repaying $3,000 of my husband's debt every month. Looking back, I came to realize that my husband deceived me. I met Steve, my husband, a year ago at a group blind date. He was well liked for his good nature and intelligence, and I was proud to be his girlfriend. Steve was pampered by his two older sisters, making him quite spoiled. In contrast, I was known for my independence and maturity, which many thought complemented his nature. Despite working at a large corporation, Steve was frugal and did not spend money lavishly. We often discussed our saving methods and dined at reasonably priced yet delicious restaurants. When he proposed to me, I accepted without hesitation. We both wanted to keep wedding expenses low, so after registering our marriage, we only had a photo shoot without a ceremony. With preparations for the salon underway and limited time to search for a new home, I agreed to Steve's suggestion to live with his parents for the time being. The in-laws' place was a 2-story house, and we moved into the second floor. I had only met my in-laws once, but they seemed lovely, and I believed we could build a good relationship. I even hoped they might help us if we ever had kids. However, one thing that stood out was my mother-in-law's deep affection for Steve. Being the long-desired boy born after 2 daughters and having landed a job at a major company, she frequently boasted about him, repeating how intelligent and outstanding he had always been. On the other hand, my father-in-law seemed relaxed and mentioned his upcoming retirement and how he's looking forward to enjoy his post-retirement life. But things started to get a bit off when discussing rent and living expenses after moving in. When I asked Steve about the amount, he responded he'd check.
Can you pay $2,000 for now?
What? $2,000? Isn't that a bit too much since we're living together?
It's not that much. It's just that my dad's retiring this year, so their income will decrease. My mom said she'll help more around the house. Given that, $2,000 isn't too high, right?
All right, so we'll split it $1,000 each, okay? I proposed. Steve then avoided my gaze, looking uncomfortable. What's the problem?
There's something I haven't told you. It's hard to say, but I have debts.
What? Why didn't you mention this before? How much do you owe?
I can't tell you that.
Tell me. I had never imagined my husband would have debts. With a strong aversion to debt, I pressed him for the truth, and he finally spilled the beans.
I'm sorry. I think it's about $30,000.
Upon hearing the unexpected amount, I panicked, and impulsively threw a magazine that was in front of me. Steve, looking genuinely remorseful, said,
I know I should have told you. I had always intended to tell you before we got married, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Knowing how much you struggled with your father's debt and how strongly you felt about it made it even harder. I was afraid you'd hate me,
he said, tears forming in his eyes. Unable to bear accusing him any further, I distanced myself from Steve and slumped my shoulders. For now, I tried to suppress my rising anger and anxiety and focused on understanding the situation. Can you explain how this happened?
There was a time when I got hooked on horse racing. I was obsessed with it for about a year. The more I lost, the more I thought I could win it back next time, and my debt just kept growing. But I've completely stopped now.
Steve was on his knees, looking apologetic. I had always seen him as a careful spender just like me, but it turned out he had been tight on money because of his debt repayments. Given that we had already finished preparations like marriage registration and moving in, walking away now wasn't as simple as it seemed. Even considering divorce was out of the question. So I kept racking my brain for solutions to this unforeseen situation. Fine, I'll handle the $30,000 repayment. The moment I said that, Steve's gloomy face transformed, and he looked at me with hopeful eyes. However, there was a clear expectation in his gaze towards me. I immediately clarified. Don't get me wrong. I just can't bear the fact that we have this debt. I want to repay it immediately. But it felt like the expectation in Steve's eyes hadn't vanished. In this situation, it would just be me taking on the debt Steve created. I can't just repay it without setting conditions in return. I'll handle the debt, but you need to contribute to the rent and living expenses at home. It's your family home, so there should be more flexibility, right? Steve nodded with a look that seemed to be entirely relying on me. Currently, he was repaying $1,000 every month, and at this rate, it would take more than 3 years to clear the debt. We'll repay the debt in a year. I decided to repay $3,000 every month and settle everything within a year. The idea of waiting for 3 years before even considering having children felt too long. I had planned to run the beauty salon with 2 stylists, but I decided to cut costs by only hiring an assistant, increasing profits. It might be hard work without a stylist, but if my mother-in-law helps with the housework, I can concentrate on my job. When I started discussing specific repayment plans, Steve brightened up and nodded, then suddenly began.
Actually, there's something else I haven't told you.
It was about his job. He worked at a major company, but his relationship with his boss did not go so well that he decided to quit. Now he works for a subcontractor who took a liking to him. His salary is about half of what he used to earn. But he hid the fact he quit due to his high pride, kept it a secret from friends and family. Doubts arose about how much I could trust Steve, who had been hiding such major things. Regardless, I emphasized that he should be honest with his parents about the situation and ask for their support in our lives, so I could focus on work. Steve nodded and acknowledged everything repeatedly. As a couple, we decided on our roles and started our new life aimed at debt repayment. However, the reality was far from what Steve had described. Early in the morning, my mother-in-law would wake me up saying things like, "Jessie, what about breakfast?" And "You need to hang the laundry now, or it'll get stale." I almost blurted out, "Didn't you say you'd help me with housework so I could concentrate on work?" But since I come home late, she takes care of all the evening chores and dinner. Thus, I reluctantly began to wake up early to handle the morning chores. I thought my mother-in-law probably didn't feel good seeing me as another woman and a daughter-in-law not doing household chores. However, I was living with a heavy heart, forced into unexpected hard labor for Steve's debt repayment. The beauty salon closes at 8 p.m., but assistants finish at 7 p.m., so I end up doing all the cleaning and preparation for the next day by myself and would be able to get home by 10 p.m. When I get home, my mother-in-law, who already took a shower and relaxing in the living room, will shout out, "Do the dishes." On the sink, dishes for 3 people, along with pots and pans, are left as they are. I heat up the cold food in the microwave, eat alone, and then do all the dishes in a repetitive routine. There were times when laundry was left undone, and I would fold it to prevent wrinkles. And in the morning, I wake up at 5 a.m., finish the laundry, make breakfast, and leave the house by 8 a.m. This is because I'm running the business by myself, and it wouldn't work otherwise. Tuesday is my only day off from work, when suddenly my mother-in-law said, "I'm going out, so can you handle dinner and lunch for John? You're not doing anything every day. And please finish cleaning," she said, and then she went out all dressed up. Cooking lunch for my retired father-in-law and cleaning the entire house would take up my whole day. John seemed interested in computers, spending each day on the computer checking stocks. After living this hard life for half a year, I often felt unwell and said to Steve, "Your mother did agree to help with the chores, right? I work late for your debt repayment." Then Steve, looking away, said,
Oh yeah, of course, but my mother has done housework for many years. She might want to rely on you sometimes.
He changed the topic. "I wish you'd help with the chores at least a bit. At least do the dishes."
I do want to help, but my mom says housework is for women, and doesn't let me in the kitchen.
I couldn't argue anymore. I started to feel that living together was a mistake. If it was just the two of us, Steve could handle the housework and I could rest on my precious day off without cleaning the big house. Then one Sunday evening, maybe because of daily fatigue, I fainted from severe anemia while at work. Fortunately, there were no customers and no more appointments, so I decided to close the shop early to go to the hospital. But on the way home, I saw something unbelievable. It was Steve holding a horse racing newspaper in his right hand with a gloomy face coming out of the station. When Steve noticed me, he quickly hid the newspaper behind him and said,
"Oh, what a coincidence."
I was so shocked, I yelled at Steve. "Didn't you say you'd quit betting on horses?" With my health deteriorating, I lost my temper and shouted out loud.
"It's a misunderstanding. I just wanted to see the results."
Steve was obviously lying. I was fuming, thinking of who was responsible for my suffering, and remained silent until we got home. At home, we didn't speak, and my mother-in-law, sensing the tension, spoke to me while Steve was in the shower. "Hey, Jessie, I'm a bit concerned. How are you two? It's not good to take out your frustration on Steve just because your salon isn't doing well." "My salon? It's going reasonably well." "You don't have to lie. Steve already told us. You borrowed money to start the business, and now you're struggling to pay it back." "What are you talking about? I've never been in debt in my life. Rather, it was Steve who put me into debt and forced me into monthly repayments. Yet I'm desperately repaying the startup capital. Steve should have told my in-laws about the debt." "Steve is helping you repay your debt, isn't he? That's why we've been saying we don't need rent, but since we're living together, you should at least help out with the chores, right?" "Wait, let me get this straight. Steve is not paying you the rent?" "Huh? What are you talking about? Is every business owner like this?" "No, you've got it all wrong. To begin with, it was Steve who made the debt." The story had changed in ways I didn't know about. I explained the situation to my mother-in-law again. I told her how I'm repaying the debt that Steve incurred by $3,000 every month, and that Steve had told me she would help with the housework so I could concentrate on my work when we moved into their home. After quitting a major company in a short period of time and switching jobs, he is now working at a company that pays about half of his previous salary. My mother-in-law shook her head in disbelief and said, "I knew you were just making things up, just as Steve's head. Is it every business owner's skill to be good at lying?" It seems she believes everything I say is a lie. It's all true. I even saw Steve at the station today after he came back from the horse race. "You and your lies. Steve left for his part-time job this morning. I can't believe you doubt your husband who's been working so hard even on his days off to help repay your debt." It seemed my mother-in-law had complete trust in her son and wouldn't listen to me. "Aren't you using all of my son's salary to repay the debt you created, leaving him with no money to spare? I feel sorry for him. There's not much I can do to help." She began to cry, feeling sorry for her son's plight. It seemed that Steve wasn't paying any rent or living expenses to his mother, but rather was getting pocket money from her to spend freely. "Honestly, John and I have been talking and wondering if this marriage was a mistake. We couldn't tell just from meeting you once that you were so unreasonable and dishonest." I wanted to retort, but felt it would be pointless. As I sat silent, Steve came out of the shower and asked carelessly,
"What's going on?"
This infuriated me and I shouted, "What were you thinking? Lying to your mother like that? Aren't you ashamed?" In her agitation, the mother-in-law confronted Steve, saying, "How dare you act so superior to my son? You're the one who's lying and pathetic." Steve, not fully understanding the situation, looked shocked and hid behind his mother. Seeing his reaction and reflecting on my own desperate efforts to repay the debt without knowing the truth made me angry and frustrated. "Tell the truth. Admit that you made the debt," I shouted. But Steve quickly stepped forward and said,
"Let's not talk about this here. Let's go upstairs. Calm down,"
and forcefully took me upstairs. As we left, my mother-in-law yelled at our backs, Don't waste the money my son worked so hard for. Selfish wives like you should leave the house. The moment we entered the room, the first thing Steve said was,
"You're really stupid."
I was stunned. Without a hint of remorse, he added,
"I mean, my parents are letting us live here for free. What's the problem? We save on rent and living expenses, so we have more money to spend. Isn't that great? I had it all set up perfectly. There's no need to foolishly tell the truth."
So you blamed everything on me.
Well, that story feels more credible, and somehow it's persuasive, right? I feel it has potential for the future. If you think about being rewarded someday, even if you have to sacrifice yourself, there's a sense of purpose in working.
I was at a loss for words at Steve's cunningness, and I could no longer trust him, who was only looking out for himself. Moreover, I couldn't feel any remorse from him, especially after learning that he was still involved in horse racing even after claiming he had quit. This meant that there was a high probability of facing the same issues over and over again if we continued together. Feeling that continuing our married life was impossible, I told him I want a divorce, to which Steve responded,
"Fine, but don't ask for any alimony. And don't ask me to pay back the money you've been paying off so far. After all, you've been living here for free."
Although I felt the house wasn't worth the $3,000 in rent, I reluctantly agreed because I just wanted to end things with him quickly. When we announced our divorce, my mother-in-law looked relieved and said, "Finally, we all will be free." On my moving day, as I was loading my belongings into the truck, I heard my mother-in-law shouting loudly, "Steve, the story I heard doesn't match up at all." Suddenly, Steve ran out of the entrance towards me, crying,
"Jesse, please help me."
Mary, who looked so angry, chased after him. "If you're getting divorced and Jesse is leaving, you won't need to pay back the debt, right? At least pay some rent."
"Why should I? You've let me live here for free until now."
"Your father invested all his retirement money in stocks, and we don't have any extra. Now the only one we can rely on is you, Steve." Looking, I could see my father-in-law peeking out from the living room window, looking guilty. I knew he checked stock sites on his computer almost daily. Maybe he lost a lot from novice investing. It seemed that in an attempt to recover the losses, he dug himself deeper. Maybe it's hereditary.
"No, I'm also stretched thin. I still haven't finished paying off my debt, and my salary is so low. I can't do what's impossible,"
Steve exclaimed, abandoning all pride, shook off his mother, and ran towards me.
"Jesse, please, let's talk one more time. Please don't abandon me."
He knelt before me in deep apology. I stood in shock at his pitiful state. The mother-in-law smacked Steve's back hard. "You failure! I can't believe you're my son!" There was no trace of the smart son who once worked for a big company. Then John came out slowly and said to me,
"I'm sorry for all the trouble. I think we'll sell this house and start over. Please, forgive my selfish family,"
in a polite tone. Steve shouted selfishly,
"Dad, what are you saying? If you sell the house, where will we live?"
The mother-in-law, seemingly in shock, sat down and wept. The last scene I saw of the two of them, utterly devoid of pride, was pitiful, but given how they had selfishly pushed me into a corner, I thought they got what they deserved. I left the scene feeling refreshed. Even though the drama seemed to continue, once I finished loading my belongings, I left immediately. That was the last day I had any connection with Steve's family. From what I've heard, they indeed sold the house, as my former father-in-law declared, and are now living in a cheap rental. The former in-laws are desperately working at a senior employment center to pay off their son's debt and their living expenses. Steve, monitored by his mother, is reportedly working even on his days off to repay his debts. He probably can't go to his beloved horse races. Having worked tirelessly to repay Steve's debts after a marriage, this is what I expected. Now my beauty salon business is flourishing, and I employ 2 stylists. I'm filled with satisfaction and joy every day at work. A beautician I met recently offered me an opportunity to train in Italy. I'm thinking of focusing on that training, leaving the salon operations to my 2 stylists. If I had continued my marriage, such an opportunity wouldn't have come my way. Every day I'm convinced that my decision to divorce was right. However, the person accompanying me on the Italy training is a man, so I can't imagine what the future holds.